Good afternoon, persons of quality. Welcome to another session of the Aquinas Lecture Series. Today, our speaker is Dr. Molly Patterson of the Political Science Department, and her presentation is entitled Popular Culture, Political Imagination, and Public Policy. Would you please all join me in welcoming Dr. Patterson?
Thank you, Dr. Chesley, and thank you everyone who is taking time out of a hectic moment in the end of semester rush to come think about politics. And I'm pretty sure we've all had enough of thinking about politics recently, so I'm especially grateful. Even if you are trying to ignore the politics, it's been a little bit hard to get away from recently. Hopefully this will be a little bit different angle to think about it from. I'm not doing PowerPoint, and I don't even have really cool video clips, which is unfortunate because that would be appropriate for this sort of talk. But I did distribute some kind of general outlines of where I'm headed for those who are more visually inclined like I am and can use a sort of map of where we are and where we're going. So I was going to start, this is a think piece, and hopefully a collaborative think piece where we can kind of share some ideas. There are a number of different things I've been thinking about for quite a while that I'm trying to tie together here. This isn't a finished research project. It's more of an exploration about, is there a research project to do here, and if so, what might it look like? I'm going to start with imagination because that's something that I started thinking about when I was exploring dissertation projects a very, very, very long time ago. And the idea of imagination was interesting to me, and I was doing work in political psychology, so it seemed appropriate. But it wasn't something that political psychology was talking about a whole lot. In fact, it doesn't seem to have been talking about it at all. Other disciplines do, and that's something that we might talk about towards the end, is what literatures are relevant, who has something to say to this topic that's important to talk to. But I was thinking about imagination in part because I was a teaching assistant, and I had a very striking class. It was an early class, early in the quarter, talking about an introduction to political science, and they were reading Aristotle, and we were supposed to be talking about Aristotle's view of democracy. And one of the things that we were trying to talk about, or at least I was trying to talk about, is could they imagine a democracy that is different from our democracy? Did democracy have to be the way we did it, with elections and checks and balances and separation of powers and all of that good stuff, or could democracy be something else? This conversation was a total non-starter. And there are many, many reasons that that happens in many, many classes. But I think part of it had to do with this problem of being able to imagine alternatives. At about the same time, a local newspaper, the Orange County Register, ran an article about a local community college repertory theater. They have a very good student-run repertory, and they interviewed some of the faculty. And one of the things that a faculty member said is that in recent years, he'd been spending a lot more time teaching students how to play. That imaginative play was not something that they necessarily came into the class doing readily, that it was something that they had to learn how to do. That was interesting, and it actually coincided with something I had been talking about with my mother. Now, I understand that it is considered unprofessional to admit that you have a mother, let alone that you take her seriously intellectually. Mine happens to be very smart, and she's a teacher and a keen observer of early childhood development and patterns of family interaction. And so we had been talking quite a lot about how television had changed patterns of interaction in the family, and also how it had affected imaginative play. And she has many less than kind things to say about television and its impact on childhood imagination. And in some ways, this talk is a rebuttal to her that she's not going to hear. Well, maybe once I get it fleshed out, I'll share. But I'm not quite ready for the mom audience yet. So there were a number of things that were coming from different directions and making me think about how do we imagine, why is imagination important, is our capacity for imagination expanding or diminishing? And while I didn't pursue that interest at the time, I've been keeping some notes, and a couple of recent classes have brought it to my mind yet again, and have helped me focus in particular on two ways in which imagination strikes me as very important for politics and public policy. And one we've started to talk about already. That is the capacity to imagine a political system or a political culture or a way of life that is different from the one we currently have. Part of how this came up is, again, and it's actually been coming up fairly often now that it's on my mind. I'm using a book in two of my classes this semester called Deep Economy by Bill McKibben. And I'm using it in introductory classes. And it's an argument against growth-centered economics. It's challenging the assumption that we must have growth in order to survive. He actually argues that our emphasis on growth and efficiency, while it once was very important to our survival, it is not helping us any longer. Not only is it a problem for environmental reasons, but it's not making us any happier. And he is arguing that we should focus more on local systems and repairing communities. And part of why I picked this book is it's really a very different tone from how I so often teach. One of my classes, of all things, state government and politics, has been described by some people as the most depressing class they've ever taken in their life. Because if you're talking about Michigan state politics, the news is grim. So I've been thinking about, well, how do I present positive alternatives? How do I give students the sense that all is not lost, that there is hope, that there are things that they can do? And Deep Economy is full of examples of people doing interesting things all around the world. There are stories about local food production and local radio in Vermont, discussions about different practices of dealing with seeds in India, rabbit raising in China. It's full of examples of things that are going horribly wrong, but also things that people are doing that are different and seem to be very promising. There's this great sense of possibility. In discussing this with the one class that has read it so far, it wasn't a hit. Now, once again, there are many reasons for this. It's full of examples, and this turns out to be a bad thing. I thought that was actually part of what made it so pleasant and so different. But despite the fact that it is full of examples of how things could be different, and in fact people are doing things differently, they still have the feeling that nothing can change. They still have the feeling that the economic system or the power of Walmart or the political system is too big and too broken to shift. That people are unavoidably, perhaps, or just so broken at this point, that they're fundamentally selfish, and that this selfish nature, the drive for more, isn't going to change, and that people will not become more community-centered or be willing to live with less, even if it makes everybody better off in the long run. And so this sense of despite being given lots of examples to fuel the imagination, this resistance to imagining that things could be different has been very striking. So one reason why I think imagination is important is this capacity to see something else, to be able to see something that we don't have, and to also imagine how you get there, because you can't possibly get anywhere different, at least not deliberately, not anywhere that you actually want to get, unless you can imagine what that possibility looks like. So that's one reason why imagination has been striking me as important for public policy and politics. The other reason why imagination has been striking me as important comes from conversations in which it would be helpful if students could imagine other people's perspectives, how it is that other people believe things that are different from what they believe, or how it is that other people come to live differently than they live, to have lives that are different from their lives. And this is kind of similar to the first question, the ability to imagine that there are other realities or other possibilities out there. But it's different in the sense that it also calls into the question thinking about how their own life, how they might have turned out differently than they do, and that personal element seems to be important. This is kind of multidimensional. You have the capacity to imagine how other people come to think or believe what they do. And this is important in part because it's how you see political opponents or people you disagree with as real people as opposed to simply crazy people that are not worth talking to. And then the capacity to imagine how other people might be affected by public policies is important. If we put this policy in place, here's what it means for you, but what might it mean for other people? And then there is this question about how people might live differently and why. And this frequently comes up when we're talking about poverty or recently healthcare policy. There are an awful lot of conversations in which it comes out that students cannot imagine being poor, which is always really a little awkward for me because there are always students in the room who I know are coming from very difficult economic circumstances. They're struggling to pay tuition, they can't buy books, and they can imagine quite vividly what it's like to not have economic resources, but they don't like to put themselves on the spot by announcing this. But that inability to imagine how one might be poor or the possibility that you yourself could someday be homeless through job loss, mental illness, some unforeseen circumstance. I mean, this is important. And it makes me think, and I will only think about this briefly to save us all, about John Rawls' theory of justice. John Rawls, in talking about his theory of justice, uses a thought experiment, the idea of the veil of ignorance. And he talks about how you can figure out what is just by having people work out social arrangements without knowing where they themselves are placed in the current social order. So you're talking about what would be fair, but you don't know whether you're rich or poor. You don't know what your occupation is. So you imagine this veil of ignorance. You don't know about your own social position, and then you try and work out what would be fair for everybody, given that there will be different social positions. How do we decide what the rules should be, how to distribute resources, that sort of thing. That's an act of imagination. It requires being able to imagine yourself in a variety of different positions. If you can't imagine that it is possible for you to be poor or to be sick, I mean, that's really striking recently. I mean, particulars of the healthcare policy aside, the capacity to imagine that you could be sick and you might not have health care is a really important imagination to have in order to figure out how do we do healthcare policy. If you can't imagine that, there is no reason to have a healthcare policy. And I have been struck by the number of students who are young and healthy and seem to think that that will always be the case. Now, I'm picking on students here because that's who I have most of my daily conversations with. But I can point to any number of conversations with other people who are supposedly older and wiser, who also have that lack of imagination. And of course, I routinely run into my own lack of imagination when I can't figure something like out. How somebody could possibly come to believe whatever it is they're believing, especially around election time. This affects all of us. So these are the two the two kind of broad categories of imagination that I have in mind when I'm thinking about public policy and why we should be concerned about imagination, how it matters. So how did we get to pop culture in this talk? I actually want to explore the possibility that popular culture could be a positive force in cultivating imagination. This, of course, is somewhat counterintuitive. Most of the people that have written about culture, mass media, popular culture, imagination, have done so from a very critical perspective, and for good reason. That if you take somebody like Michael Parenti, who has a book called Make Believe Media, it's a book all about how the media reinforces dominant ideologies and how the media obscures other realities. So poor people aren't terribly visible in the media, or when they are, they're caricatures of poor people. So there are all sorts of reasons to be skeptical about the media, and part of why I wanted the media in here is that there is a pet theme along these lines that I have long wanted to write an essay about. One of my personal guilty pleasure favorite genres is about the teacher who saves the public education system, the stand and deliver genre. I love those movies. I can't help it. You know, that I want to believe that there is somebody who can figure it out and make it all better. I have not seen the documentary Waiting for Superman yet, but that, I think, accurately captures the mindset that is reflected in the stand and deliver genre. That there is a Superman out there that can come in and single-handedly, frequently with a baseball bat, the amount of force, violence, coercion, bribery that is involved in straightening out the public school system but as ideological content goes, that's interesting, right? That's how we imagine these issues get solved, with more discipline. You just need to be stricter, or maybe you need to be more compassionate, but there is some individual quality, some personal characteristic that if you just get that individual quality or personal characteristic right, you can turn the public education system around. I love the movies. That's not going to fix public education, I'm pretty sure. There are lots of people in the public education system who are working very, very hard to make this all better, and it's not happening yet. So that's an example of a genre whose ideological content probably operates contrary to effective public policy. Because what you want then are highly qualified teachers, right? You need just the right individuals, the right and highly qualified teachers are nice, but we're a little bit deranged by looking for the formula for the highly qualified teacher right now, as though you can develop. I've been working on the state standards for social studies, and I'm still a little bit bitter. The history department has especially been tormented by these. But it does put us in the mindset of trying to engineer just the right people who, through the force of their knowledge and individual personalities, can fix public education. It does not lend itself to a more nuanced assessment of public policy, something that looks at the relationship between the home and the schools, or between, my goodness, maybe there's more to public education even than home and schools. Maybe there's more of the community that's affected and that could be involved. That this emphasis on the individual savior of the public school system means that we're not looking for or imagining other ways in which this is going to be fixed. And those are probably where we need to be looking for solutions. So on the one hand, I am very sympathetic to the criticisms of mass media as perpetuating ideologies that aren't going to help us get problems solved or bring us closer together, or kind of reveal hidden truths about overlooked parts of society. And this is by no means a criticism of Michael Parenti or any of the many people who write similarly. On the other hand, when my mother, again, we're back to mom, sorry, but she is part of the thinking here, talks about imagination and how children used to do imaginative play and work out rules together. And the example that she frequently comes back to is playing cowboys and Indians, which, if we're thinking about ideological content, that's a little bit problematic. So it's great that they had to work out the rules together and figure out how to make the bows and arrows and do all of this imaginative work, but the imagination that children were doing together was still based in a shared culture. This wasn't something that they made up simply from nothing, that they started with some shared image or idea that they were working out together. And that one happened to have some political baggage with it that we could talk about, but save for later. The media does provide that point of reference for us, and in that sense can be the basis for shared conversation. That's the easy part. Part of why the media could be useful to us is because so many of us engage with mass media in one way or another. So I don't want to throw it out yet. Furthermore, the producers of media are not ideologically homogenous. The people who finance film are not the same people as the people who write scripts, are not the same people as the people who direct. Part of my evidence for the fact that there is some heterogeneity out there is the fact that conservatives regularly think that Hollywood is way too liberal, and liberals regularly think that Hollywood is way too conservative, and both of these things could be true at the same time. That you could, that what people focus on is the part that makes their argument, and there are other things going on out there. So my first argument is that Parenti's story is not the whole story, that there are other people involved and there are other stories being told. My second argument is to take a small detour through Marx, that there are changes in the forces of production. Marx is lurking in this talk. He's lurking in the back of the discussion of ideology, the idea that the ruling ideas are the ideas of the ruling class. That's kind of where Parenti is coming from. So whoever controls production of media controls the ideas that get conveyed through media. So I might as well say, yeah, he's there and I own that. I don't have a problem. But the other way in which and I think this is useful for thinking about what is possible. One way in which you get social change, according to Marx, is that the forces of production, the technology you have at your disposal to do things, changes. And changes in the forces of production put pressure on the relations of production, how people relate to each other, who owns what, who gets to control production. So what's been happening in film and media? Well, the digital revolution. May not be a huge revolution, but if you think about 10, 15 years ago, for a student in film school to make just a little 5-minute student film easily cost $3,000 to $5,000. That's one film project, because you had to buy the film, which is expensive. You have to send the film somewhere to get it processed, which is expensive. You have to pay somebody else to put titles and captions into the film. You can do all of this yourself now. You can buy a pretty decent digital camera for, it's still $3,000 to $5,000, but you can use the camera over and over again. You can edit on a Macintosh. There's very sophisticated editing software for visuals and sounds. You can put in your own captions. You can save it to DVD and mail it to all of your friends and family, or upload it to YouTube or whatever. So the technology we have to create stories is changing. The distribution systems are a little bit problematic. Like actually getting it on television or into a movie theater hasn't really changed yet. But internet and digital files and DVDs and all of that put some pressure on that too. So there is right now an opening for people to not be dependent on wealthy financiers of film and media. There's room for a lot more ordinary people to be presenting stories and distributing them. And this opens up the possibility that there's more room for discussion and different perspectives. So that's one part of why one might be optimistic. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that doesn't sound like mass media. That doesn't sound like a shared culture yet. And this is something that I am still working out, though there are a number of videos. We talk about videos going viral, about images that become compelling enough and widely distributed enough that they do become part of a shared conversation. So the fact that it's not Seinfeld, and incidentally, I did not see the final episode of Seinfeld, just in the interest of full disclosure. But the fact that it's not Seinfeld, where everybody can talk about how they watched the last episode together and what happened in the last episode, doesn't mean that it may not be on that scale, but there's still the possibility of shared conversations around media that is produced by, not your ordinary sources of film. But even within your ordinary mass media, there are some signs of things maybe sometimes being done differently. It's still complicated. There's still lots of, like Law and Order is an example that I am about to use in a positive sense, but Law and Order is also a show where you watch people's civil rights and basic humanity being routinely violated without much being said about it. So on the one hand, Law and Order is kind of a problem because it certainly acclimates us to an idea about policing and legitimate policing that's we might want to ask questions about, because that could be you. You might want to wonder how that guy was affected by the police breaking into his apartment, shoving him up against a wall, accusing him of doing things that he never did, and then just saying, oh, wrong guy, and walking away. We might ask questions of Law and Order. But on the positive side, Law and Order is one place that opens up some possibility for imagination, because the episodes, at least at times, are built around conversations between people who think differently from each other, respect each other, are both viewed positively within the narrative, and still disagree. They both make legitimate arguments, and those legitimate arguments are not resolved by the show itself. This is good for our imagination. It prompts us to think. It prompts us to evaluate different arguments and to, invites us towards a conclusion of our own, but given some more complex ways of thinking about it. That is one example of political discourse that we might imagine as an alternative to our current political discourse, where we have enemies and crazy people, and Jon Stewart analogy of the, if you saw his moment of sanity, he talks about, why would you reach across the aisle and work with somebody who's simply crazy? Being able to imagine that other person is a real rational person is important. And Law and Order at least helps foster that little bit of imagination. Another example one might point to is The West Wing, alas. It's too bad that one is gone. But again, you had a representation of a variety of perspectives. You had protagonists who were well-liked and treated well within the narrative, who still disagreed with each other. And it furthermore fostered the capacity of citizens to imagine what it is that government does. That it's really hard for people to actually figure out, what do their congressmen spend time on? What is it that the president does? Why does none of this work? And it at least provided some information that could be geared towards imagination, not to mention some really interesting policy discussions that they had, or discussions about, do you want to ideologically insipid Supreme Court judges, or do you want to politically oppose deeply committed Supreme Court judges? Those kinds of questions. Alas, though, both The West Wing and Law and Order, while doing some things to foster imagination and prompt critical thinking, and these are just examples, there are probably others, though it's hard to come up with examples of things that foster imagination. Both of those are within ordinary politics as we currently know it. So it might help us imagine, The West Wing was great for helping us imagine how ideological differences could be productive, how they could be constructive and respectful and do good things for us. But it was still within the framework of ordinary politics. Checks and balances, representative government. How might we want to imagine, or why might we want to imagine things differently? Well, we recently had a ballot initiative on whether we should redo the Michigan Constitution. It is in the Michigan Constitution that every 16 years this question has to be set before the citizens, basically because the last time somebody tried to call a constitutional convention, it was so hard that they made sure that when they finally redid the Constitution, it would be easier for anyone in the future to redo it. So they put it into the Constitution. So every 16 years we get this question about, should we have a constitutional convention? And it's probably a good thing that we're not having one right now. That there's enough turnover with term limits and not having anyone carried over from the executive branch, that there might be something new and different that actually happens this time. There are enough different people involved that it's possible. But we could actually do all sorts of different things with this government. It doesn't have to be, Michigan government is really stuck. It's kind of bogged down in ideological conflict where, even if, well, it used to be when it was one half was controlled by Democrats and the other half was controlled by Republicans, that if one side passed something that the other side basically didn't agree with, but the other side didn't want the other guys to get credit for it, that they wouldn't vote for it. There are some really deep and stupid tensions. We could redo that government. We don't have to have a bicameral partisan legislature. Nebraska doesn't. They have a one-chamber legislature, and people don't run as members of political parties. That's Nebraska. I mean, if Nebraska can do that, surely. And I'm not saying that's the answer, but it's one possibility. We could, I mean, we talk about how proportional representation would be really cool to have in this country. Well, okay, political scientists talk about this. Maybe nobody else does. We could. I mean, we could redesign our political institutions in a lot of different ways. But doing that takes a public with some sort of imagination for alternatives, a public that doesn't see trying something that different. Proportional representation is where you vote for, I know, horribly simplified, Durham, where you vote essentially for political parties, and then political parties get a number of seats proportional to how many people voted for them. So maybe only 10% of the population votes for the Green Party, but then the Green Party gets 10% of the seats in the legislature. So you could have minority party represent, you could do it. And again, this isn't actually all that wildly imaginative because lots of other places do it. But we can't imagine doing it here. So it seems like this idea of cultivating imagination and showing people possibilities and what they might look like. I mean, they don't have to be wildly radical possibilities, but sort of tease out some of the things that we could do differently. It could have actual political consequences. The media could be an ally in making some of those arguments. You don't have to be especially ideological to explore what are the implications of proportional representation. You know, what if some crazy state decided to do proportional representation? You could do a political show around that, and you don't have to be liberal or conservative to do it. There are lots of things, and okay, maybe that wouldn't sell. Though The West Wing, I will point out, did very, very well while it was on television. You can make a good show about politics. So there are some possibilities out there that the media could be entertaining, and furthermore, we now have the technology so that even if CBS or whoever decides that that's a long shot and a ridiculous idea, it's something that could be done on a smaller scale. A couple of implications of this for teaching and kind of our day-to-day existence. There are a couple of things that worry me about this train of thought, you know, trying to invest the media with some sort of positive power to help us think. One is trying to actually understand what's going on in a story. Being able to tell the difference between an argument about how things are and an argument about how things ought to be and an argument about how things can be. Can people tell the difference? Sometimes it's hard. Irony is difficult, sarcasm is difficult, telling the difference between, wait, is this the way the government really does work, or is this the way the government should work, or is this the way the government could work? Reading the media takes a fairly informed public, and so some literacy and basic understanding of politics and policy is required, and that should probably worry all of us. The other thing that worries or puzzles me is the problem of agency, going back to the stand and deliver issue. That if you want to make people feel empowered, you need to give them a protagonist who do things. Maybe not necessarily a heroic figure, but somebody that you can identify with, that you can see making changes. And this might be inherent in the narrative structure. It might be really difficult to tell stories without those kinds of roles. But that so often translates into the stand and deliver narrative, the individual who solves problems. How do we provide people with a sense of agency, with stories about being empowered and being able to change your life or to do different things, being able to impact social and political systems without turning it into a story about bootstrapping. All we need is individual will. We don't actually need public policy or public support. All we need is just the right kind of character, the right values, and we'll make it all better. Telling stories that don't turn it into the individual as hero who overcomes social structure, but to turn it into a story about a community or about cooperation or about social dynamics is challenging. And this, in fact, is something that I've started reading some sociology articles about the sociological imagination, because it seems like that actually struggles with this question of how do you get people to imagine in terms of social dynamics, not just individual effort. It's also given me actually a healthy appreciation for history, which anyone who heard me ranting about having to teach Irish history, given the fact that I'm a lousy historian and I knew nothing about Ireland going into it, I was a little bitter. But I've realized that this is actually part of what history is enormously valuable for teaching us that things used to be different. And in fact, if things used to be different, they could be different again in the future. So all of this is a very roundabout. I've gotten lost in my notes. I've been shuffling them. That's a very bad idea. So this was all sort of a very roundabout way of saying that I think there are at least three implications of this train of thought for pedagogy at Aquinas. One is that what we're doing in a liberal arts education is in part fostering imagination, potentially. That if we want citizens who not only can't simply recite and regurgitate, one way of thinking about this thing that we call critical thinking is to think about it in terms of the imagination, to imagine alternatives, to anticipate or speculate about consequences and implications. And so finding ways to foster imagination. And I'm sure that the English department's saying, oh yeah, we got that down. I mean, you guys get to do it all the time. You get to teach novels and fiction and speculation. Political science is just, this political scientist is just working on the fact that it is also part of my pedagogy and responsibility to teach imagination, and that perhaps there are other disciplines that might find that useful to think about as well. The second thought is that critical media literacy is also part of our pedagogical mission, given the fact that we are one part of a curriculum, but that media and the broader popular culture is also part of the curriculum that students are embedded in. Then teaching critical media literacy, helping them recognize stories that are being told or not told, how there is ideological content, or at least assumptions in media that they might want to recognize and be skeptical about, is important. I always feel a little guilty if I show something like Jon Stewart in class or a film. I feel like it's a cop-out. And so I back off from doing that. At the same time, I'm realizing that if we don't talk about this explicitly, then who is teaching this? Arguably, it's done younger, but hopefully our students are getting older, wiser, smarter, and capable of great critical thinking in college. So to assume that it's been done before and therefore doesn't have to be done again is, I think, problematic. So that might also be a positive responsibility in conjunction with fostering imagination. And the third thought, and this is a little bit more of an aside, but thinking about the media as potentially a positive venue for social change. If we actually have media-savvy students who are interested in telling stories or figuring out how to put their ideas out there in narrative form, how to produce and distribute. Again, obviously the English department provides a home for this, but it might be something that other departments interested in social change may be interested in fostering. I mean, we tend to dismiss that as not a real job or not actually important. You know, it seems frivolous. I mean, they might actually like what they're doing, and then it's really not a real job. So if that becomes a legitimate avenue for social change, the telling of stories, I mean, it's potentially very powerful and something that, given the fact that we do want to empower students to make change in the world, that we should maybe take that seriously as an option. And I think that's it for now.